Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Poornima Dore, Director, Analytics, Insights and Impact at Tata Trust and a visiting professor at the XLRI School of Management. We discussed her latest book, Regional Economic Diversity, Lessons from an Emergent India, co-authored with K. Narayanan. We talked about India's structural transformation and how that impacts regional diversity at the sub-state level, urban agglomeration and clustering, diversification and specialization of industry, migration, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi Poornima, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Shruti. Really glad to be here too.
In India, for all policy matters, we usually use the state as sort of the unit of analysis or the unit of policy making. But in India, even states are too large, right? So can you just walk us through what is left uncaptured when we think about the state as a unit and don't delve deeper into specific regions within each state?
You know, it's very interesting that I also realize that if we take a step back, a lot of the narrative for many of these things is a country narrative, right? How are we doing in terms of GDP? Where are we on our SDG goals? How are we performing when it comes to COP? And there is this large country level narrative, not just in India, but even globally, whether it's a comparison or whether it's even standalone, we talk country. And at best, as you said, we go to state. And in India, we're talking about Maharashtra, we are showcasing Andhra Pradesh or Telangana at Davos. And while all of that is very important, the fact is that each of our states itself are so huge, and by virtue of our population size and population density, there is just so much happening within each state that we are in danger of missing the wood for the trees when we are talking at that level of aggregation. What I have increasingly found in the course of the book, in the course of travel, is that each of these states are like a collection of sub-regions. And that's what one of the arguments I try to make through the book is that we need to look at regions that are contiguous, that are, similar in nature. And often that is happening at a sub-state level. And that level of granularity, at least, is going to be important, whether we are thinking about it as business leaders or investors or development practitioners or government, because that unit has so much happening. So, for example, one of the things that I tried to do was to look at output or value added, regional value added. And, most of our metrics stop at states. So we have state level GDP that we've been reporting for so many years. And in recent times, some amount of district GDP numbers have started coming up, but we don't capture it for all states and at that same frequency. So if I have to say something at a sub-state level, I actually had to construct an indicator of regional value added and then compare. And the hypothesis was this, that, probably we are going to find that at a state level, we've increased in terms of our output in absolute terms. But in relative terms, probably the narrative is similar. But if you go at the regional level, you really find that the relative narrative has changed so much. There are some regions that say in 2004-05 were not in the top 10 at all. And suddenly, for example, southern Gujarat is at number 2 now. Or, so there is that variation that gets masked when we are talking at state level. And part of the effort of the book was to uncover some of this and unpack it so that we are all talking a little more about the region and thinking about it more, both from a policy or a decision-making standpoint.
So what do you think is sort of the number one thing that is left uncaptured that surprised you when you started looking at regional differences, especially in terms of productivity, value added, wages, density, so on?
So I think the sheer quantum of output level differences hit me because we don't have metrics for that. And when I had to construct it and then I'm looking at the data, I'm seeing trends. One is that the absolute numbers have really increased a lot. So we've actually had a very interesting growth story if we looked at the 2005 to 2011-12 period, and even now it would be much higher than that too. So in absolute terms, we seem to, the Indian growth story seems to be all there and very, very promising and exciting. And at the same time, when we look at the relative variations are so stark. So it means that, if we looked at what Myrdal had to say about cumulative causation, or Kuznets had to say about the inverted U, and you try to juxtapose that with what this data is saying, you really find that we are moving forward, but we are moving further apart also.
Before I get to that convergence divergence point that you just hinted at, to me, what was really stark is, people like you and me, we've basically grown up in urban India, right? And especially for me, very large metropolitan area. So I always conflate value added and productivity with high density. And what really struck me is that is not necessarily the story everywhere. The place where there are most number of people is not always the place where there is maximum amount of productivity. And that's probably happening because you've taken this lovely snapshot in the midst of this structural transformation, right? Where still lots of people are still in agriculture, right? Manufacturing has not exactly taken off except in clusters. And the urbanization process is not yet complete. It's still, very much in the works. So what I found sort of quite interesting and completely surprised me is there are places in India where you see the obvious story, right? High density of people, lots of clusters of firms and employers and labor and capital. And there you get this sort of, high density, high value added or productivity. And then there are also these spaces which are completely working on very high level of skill, right? But very few people relative to, say, another region in the same state, which is largely agricultural, where there are lots of people, very, very low productivity, low value added. Was this something that surprised you? Because it surprised me until I read it. Until I finished reading it, rather.
No, I think it's great that you picked up on that, Shruti, because, I think some of these things, came to me also as fairly counterproductive, which underlined to me why we have to look at these granular questions, and not paint things in a broad brush way. So, for example, yes, there are, and I think I figured that a little more when I was looking at the per capita question. So when we're looking at output in absolute terms, and when you're looking at the per capita numbers, the regions that are standing out are very different. Uttar Pradesh, clearly, once the per capita question comes in, they actually move to the bottom 10, on many parameters, because it's there you're clear that it is the density story that is, driving the economic narrative. But if you were to look at a per household level, the numbers are not looking so rosy.
They're terrible.
Anymore. And we know that intuitively.
Yeah.
We know that in some of these pockets, healthcare access, education access have historically been problematic. But I think when you look at it like that, then it helped me also see that some of these regions, which are predominantly agrarian, are also doing very well in terms of output. So by that logic, then parts of Madhya Pradesh, which are not very high on population density, but are actually doing well, probably agricultural productivity has been showing good improvement over there. One could surmise that, some of these regions that we don't end up putting the spotlight on are having a story there. And so people who want to invest in agricultural implements or, run pilots should probably think about spaces like these to unpack what's going on and try to ride on that story as well.
Yeah, and it's also like not only do we think at a state level, normally I just think, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Hindi belt, right? At least that's how the story plays out these days in the newspapers and so on. And you realize that the difference in productivity, in agricultural productivity between just Uttar Pradesh, Bihar and Madhya Pradesh is just so stark, right? Once you start disaggregating, and especially in terms of population density, right? Again, the story in the three states is quite different. Now, one of the things that you point out, especially when you're talking about the difference between the 2004-5 period and the 11-12 period, right? is that India is clearly in the midst of this structural transformation, right? This is something that sort of started off post-liberalization and has continued. And the period when that you capture is a period of massive growth, massive improvement, lots of changes within regional areas, within the economy, and so on. And usually when we talk about structural transformation, we're talking about some kind of either sort of labor movement, that is, people are leaving their region of origin and they're moving to another place, either an industrial area or an urban area. So sort of like a spatial shift or an economic shift that helps them get out of agriculture, right? That's the standard narrative. We need to get out of agriculture. We need to move to industry and sort of high skilled services. But this requires a physical move in most cases. How much physical movement do you see happening, either at a temporary level or at a permanent level? And is that what is impeding, the big structural transformation story in India, the inability to physically move from one region to another?
Yeah, we are actually in a very interesting, and during this time period that we've looked at. So if I were to look at the larger structural transformation narrative that is standard, which is agriculture, then moves to manufacturing typically, and then the services story. We all know that India has kind of skipped that stage and has seen the services sector probably fire up more in many such locations. One interesting pattern which made me think was this, that construction as a sector has seen a lot of action in this time. And typically, some part of it gets captured in manufacturing or some part of it gets clubbed with services, but we don't call it out separately, And so that was something that I tried to do here, even while looking at the information, was to call out construction as a separate sector, because I don't think one was able to do justice, if one was putting it in one of these buckets, because it is probably one of those segments that has boomed the most in this time, and both in rural and in urban. And in many cases, you will see more in rural. So there is so much rural construction that has been happening, both in terms of people building houses or roads or, utilities getting created, or even this whole thing about small towns, settlements becoming towns, not yet classified as such, but they're actually becoming hubs where more and more people are moving. So I think this has been a time where there has been a lot of people movement actually, but not all of that is necessarily permanent. So there is a lot of this circular migration that has been happening. And I think as part of my work, I was looking at some of our programs on migration and skilling. During those years, I've had the opportunity to actually run some of that. And it's definitely a fact that people have been moving with 6-month timeframes or 9-month timeframes. You keep your base at the village where you possibly have a plot of land, but you are traveling to one of either the smaller urban centers or even a rural center where construction is happening, and you base there, or you are a brick kiln worker and you are going with your family there for a 9-month period. And then you are coming back when it's harvest time, either on your own farm or doing sharecropping on somebody else's farm. So there has been a tremendous amount of movement, clearly, of people. In some cases, I think it has been permanent as well, where, people have, and a lot of, I think the permanent movements are around certain trades where marketability is very high. So if construction as a trade has a movement, they're moving out of the village permanently, but they're not, say, in Delhi all the time. They're there for 2-3 years while that construction is happening, and then the contractor calls them to, say, Bangalore, or then they're moving to Lucknow. So they're shifting base continuously. But as far as their village is concerned, they have moved out, and they're visiting, say, during Holi or a festival or Diwali, but that's not their base anymore. Similarly, certain trades like, say, plumbing, now Kendrapada district in Odisha seems to be a great outsourcing of plumbing unit, and you will find the best plumbers. If you talk to them, they'll say, yeah, we're from Kendrapada. It's become like a thing where, the next generation goes, cooks from Rajasthan. So there are these trade routes that have been happening, and which are also then connected with some of these sectors, which explain the movement of people and the way, say, the economic geography is evolving.
I'm glad you mentioned construction because, you're right. In terms of post 1991, it's probably the biggest new sector that has emerged. And it also makes sense, right? In the sense that as India's growth story started taking off, government revenue started increasing and people started getting richer, which meant both more personal construction, like sort of at the household level, and also at the government infrastructure level. So, the story lines up perfectly. And the other aspect of this, which often stays hidden, and I think Shrayana Bhattacharya was talking about it, is that this sector can also explain the gap between how much men have benefited from the reform story in terms of labor force participation and opportunities and migration and movement versus women getting left behind. Because as you said, typically the story with construction is unless you're female from a very, very, very poor household, you're typically not working in construction, right? If you're even in the second lowest quintile, you tend to be the sort of female profile who is left behind, and it is the male member of the household who is sort of going in for construction and so on. Now, the reason construction is this sort of driver, does this in any way impede the structural transformation or does it hasten it? I ask in the following sense that because most of this migration seems very temporary, does this mean that because people are sort of moving in this circular way, it impedes clustering, it impedes manufacturing, it impedes urban centers from becoming larger urban centers and sort of, that growth story? Or is this just you're taking a snapshot at a moment in time and construction plays a particular role and eventually it'll slow down and it'll be something else?
So I actually see it as a very positive move. And I think it's nice that you brought it. I just finished reading Shayana's book actually, and I thought she does a very, very great job of, bringing out some of these nuances. I think, yes, it is a fact that women do get left behind and it is the male members who are largely migrating. But I've also seen evidence of significant family migration also, where the wife and child and husband as a unit also move. And a lot of that does happen in construction. But it is true that this is normally for the lower quintile of the population. However, I think there are two side effects of this that I see. One is that the family is earning more as a unit because both are working and they are stepping out. And so it is definitely the first rung of moving to the next, level of development or access. The terms of employment are not great and a lot needs to happen there. And I think some of the interventions around the construction welfare board, access to education, what construction workers are now eligible for and entitled to, and making those entitlements happen, I think a lot of work needs to happen there. But I see these as steps in the direction of an economy that's moving forward. So it's like a new sector where a lot of growth has been happening. And I think it will continue to grow for a significant period of time because there are still many areas where roads need to be laid, still a lot of households where kacha houses need to still become pakka. Many small towns need to have better housing and other facilities that need to get built. So I see these as steps towards an economy which is becoming more mature, pathways to people having the next rung on the employment ladder, and exposure. So families, I think, that are moving out and are traveling are also growing in terms of how they see the world, how they engage with markets, what goods and products they are, exposing themselves to. And I do believe that even the women who are, experiencing these are going to in time be moving one step ahead. Whether they're in construction themselves, their ability to flex their muscles and navigate or negotiate is increasing every day. The way it happened for us when we came to Delhi to study and we saw this big place and we started living life on our terms. I think for this, as time is evolving, I think this is a force for change. I also see the women who stay back in the village, who are running their farms or who are holding fort alone, building a lot of resilience.
Yeah. And there's some lovely literature on this, how they become the primary economic decision makers.
Yeah.
And therefore that also has political consequences and social consequences when more and more women become the economic decision makers.
Exactly. So I think these are things which are of course going to take time for it to fully play out. But I don't see this as an impediment. I see this as a very positive, construction as a very constructive growth engine, which, will open up pathways to better movement. I think this talk now about, and with Aadhaar and other things, universal access to ration card or the universality of certain entitlements means that movement is slowly and steadily improving. The side narrative is also with regions becoming a little tighter, the way we have, my country, my nation, similarly, my region, employment for people, domicile. That narrative has honestly always been there as part of, local political discourse. So that will, of course, be a countervailing force to this kind of movement narrative. But I think UPI is another big change where money can move very fast. That makes it easier for people to move as well, because sending money back home is not so difficult anymore. So if I have to be honest, I'm a little optimistic about some of these patterns because I see them as constructive steps forward for better mobility, better access, and hopefully at the next rung. But a lot more to be done on social security and entitlements.
Actually, it's great you touched on that. What I meant by impediment was not that this is not a great story. My worry is more what is forcing them to have one foot in the village and one foot in agriculture. So what I meant by sort of an impediment is what is preventing them from embracing this story all the way. And you talked about both, social welfare entitlements and sort of social security. Is it that most of the entitlements in India are tied to the local geography and most of the subsidies are rural and agricultural? That is, people can't take it with them and move, right? So I think that could be one possibility. And the other is, of course, the land markets are terrible, right? We've bifurcated the land market to such an extent that most states, it's not easy to change the land use of agricultural land and it's not easy to buy and sell land. And even for the buyers, there are ceiling limits on how much they can own. So it's not, that automatically depresses the prices for the sellers, right? Who want to exit these tiny pieces of, largely unproductive land, which they're using to, mostly feed the household and maybe some more vegetables that can be given away in the market and so on and so forth. So is that what is going on in terms of impeding them? Or is it that the urban areas, it's entirely an informal sector. It's not a great place for a family to move. Urban housing is impossible. How do you see this story currently where most of these families still have one foot in the rural, unproductive / agricultural sector?
I would think that there is some amount of inertia there at play as well, because historically you have had a place in the village. You've had even if you are not actively participating in agriculture, you would not want to let it go entirely, even if you have brothers or sisters or other people, holding fort there. Historically, there has been this thing about having your own land and having roots there. But it is also true that as you said, our cities are not geared to receive this influx that is, happening. And there is a lot of pushback. There is the entitlements are not, of course, and let's not even use a word like entitlement, services, access to basic services in the city versus the village. I think there are challenges on both ends. So I actually think that there's a lot more which has to happen in the smaller cities and smaller towns, which are going to be places where people are going to move to. And we do have an opportunity to build for the future there, where, you invest in housing, you invest in sanitation, you prepare the, smaller centers for the influx that's going to come in, so that you're not only populating a Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Indore, but you're looking at tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. And in the conversations I do have with the Smart Cities Mission and Amrit Cities and folks there, my view on this is that a lot more growth is going to come. So one of the things that I try to look at here in the book was that is this growth narrative happening more where proximity to a million plus city is there, or is it happening in other cities also? And when one tested for that, I didn't know what the outcome. I did not go with a hypothesis in mind, but naturally, most of our investments have been towards our larger cities, right? Clearly, there isn't that correlation that the higher output or the higher diversification, etc., is happening only near the larger cities. And that brings out this fact that then a lot is happening with the smaller cities as well. And if they are going to be hubs where growth is going to happen, where access to skills is, high and therefore has the potential to draw more money, investment, etc., then it's a great opportunity to buck the trend and invest in some of these places, have construction happen there, have, build for the future, so that these questions that you were, highlighting, that do people who move have that security of where they will stay, how they will live? Because if I just zoomed out into the larger question of agglomeration or regional growth, there are two kinds of choices, right? One is firms are choosing where they will set up units or factories or grow, where they will grow. And people are choosing where will they move. So these are the two cuts, right? The firm is making a choice and the household is making a choice. And that's kind of what is driving whether a region is going to grow or not. And if we think about where are people going to move more, it's likely to be some of the smaller urban centers going forward. And if we prep for that a little in advance, then we are likely to have better facilities and make it easier for families or households to want to settle there and not see it as a temporary makeshift arrangement.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, India's already far more urban than the numbers reflect, right? One, because, of course, the previous census is completely outdated and the new census is still not out 2 years and counting. So that is, one kind of problem. But the other is also there has to be a technical change in definition, right, from the government on how a region is categorized as a city or as a rural area. There's a lot of reluctance in that, right? Kerala, which is mostly urban, is still reluctant to do that because, most rural governments end up getting far better sort of fiscal packages, intergovernmental transfers, so on. So there's that story going on. But coming to clusters, right? So there are two things going on when it comes to clustering. In India, we already have, when we look at it at the state level, there's a divergence, right? The richer states are not converging with the poorer states, or rather the poorer states are not converging with the richer states, As it happens in the growth story, there's that entire idea of catching up, right? And that has not yet started happening in India. We still have divergent outcomes. That is, the richer states are going to get richer faster than the poorer states are going to get richer. And you also find some evidence of this at the sub-state level, that is at the regional level, right? There are some areas where there is convergence and there are lots of areas where there is actually divergence going on. What explains whether there is going to be convergence or divergence at the sub-state level?
So, Shruti, I've tried to look at this from 2-3 parameters. One being the whole economic structure. What is the economic structure of the region? Can we look at factors like output, like the economic mix, which is where, how specialized or diversified is that region? Similarly, what is the density of population? Can we look at size in terms of geographic area or population? These are two ways in which you are large when you have a huge workforce, or you are large because your geographical area itself means there is greater arable land and, or forest cover, etc. So one strand which, I tried to look at was this whole part of what is the economic structure like. I call it economic structure, but these are the subparts about, size, composition, and the second...
And value added.
And the other part, to look at access. So one is, what is our economic structured as regionally? And two, how can we describe it from 3 lenses of access? One being access to finance. So what is the credit footprint like? because is money available defines a lot about what kind of economic activity can happen in the place. Second being access to skills, the logic being that if you have a skilled workforce, if you have people with certain skill sets, your chances, your odds of being able to perform better economically are higher, or you're going to attract that kind of industry more. And the third being access to markets. Do you have proximity to a city? Do you have proximity to coastal areas where there are ports? I would have liked more regional indicators of infrastructure and government policy, which I wish I had been able to layer in, but at that granularity, it was not there at the time. So if we looked at two of these axes, one being of economic structure and the second being of access. And what I tried to do was look at, data across the NSS regions. So to unpack then state to a region level, where how, we chose to define it. And Professor Narayan and I also discussed this a little bit about, what all are the ways in which historically this has been defined. And then when I was looking at how the census and NSS, they have spent a lot of time, right, looking at these definitional questions of how do you, cut the country or slice and dice the data. And I found that the NSS region is a very interesting framework because it looks at regions as geographically contiguous. So the National Sample Survey has over the years built this framework to understand how do geographically contiguous areas with similarity of language or socio-economic profile, can they be categorized into these subcomponents? And so by that definition of NSS region, India, which has these so many states and union territories where that number comes to about roughly 35, at an NSS region level, you have 75 to 85 NSS regions. In 2004-5, the country was broken up into 78 actually. But for my study, I dropped a couple of the union territories which did not have statistically significant data. But 75 or 85 regions of a country is a fairly wide enough. It's not as large as district, which is more than 650 units, but it is more than state, which is, and union territories, which is around 35, right? And it is still giving you a lens which is deeper and which is able to tell you something where data has consistently been collected in the country, which is publicly verified. So I was looking at some of these, filters to look at the information, both in what kind of information on these two axes and what information, which framework can one look at. And on this, what I tried to do was layer the population census data, because that had granular information of a certain variety. And access to finance is not captured by either of these. So RBI data, which looks at banking and financial access, credit, etc. Now, if we look at if we unpack regions now with that, and we ran a cluster analysis on that, it tells us that some of these regions are actually closer together in their descriptive behavior, regions which actually belong to different states. So what I mean to say is that parts of Odisha are actually, like southern Odisha is showing, or on these parameters is behaving much more like central Maharashtra or Gadchiroli. They are tribal, they are densely forested, they have serious issues around access to health and sanitation. At the same time, their agricultural output seems to be fairly strong. So there are these patterns that, this kind of a cut was, has thrown up, which has, forces one to think that the regional story, and so to answer your question, what is, defining these clusters, it is parameters like these. What is the economic composition? Is it specialized or diversified in terms of the economic activities people there are taking up? What is the extent of access to finance? What is the extent of access to skills? And places which are similar on these parameters are showing some common characteristics which can possibly help us plan or help us build policies in a, with a different kind of a cut or a different kind of a lens.
You've set it up in such an interesting way, because in your book, the entire story of regional economic diversity is one of clustering. and agglomeration, right? I mean, that's not very surprising given the very large literature on this. But what is interesting is when we think about convergence or divergence, the places that have clustered look like other places that have clustered, irrespective of state boundary, and those are converging. And the places that have not clustered are diverging from the places that have clustered, irrespective of which state we're talking about, right? So the convergence and divergence story now is no longer as standard as, oh, Bihar is not converging with Kerala, right? It is more that there are some parts of Bihar which might be converging with some parts of Odisha or some parts of Maharashtra, and there are some parts of Kerala which are not converging with anything else, right? So it's that kind of a cut which is super interesting. So I think it's helpful to get into the idea of clusters and agglomeration, right? So the standard economic story around clusters, and you've hinted at this briefly, is people move because people are looking for different economic opportunities, and firms are looking for places to set up, their particular enterprise. And firms are more likely to set up where they can find the labor which will match their capital, right? And people are more likely to move wherever they can find employment for their skill. So this is one of the reasons we start seeing clustering, right? And the opposite of that is as clusters start getting larger and larger, right? You get the opposite. Instead of clustering, you also get a lot of diversification, right? So now you have lots of people with lots of different skills, lots of firms with lots of different kinds of production profiles or production processes who all end up in the same place. So at the region level, what is driving the story in India when it comes to clustering? Is it reduction in transport costs? Is it, which is a standard story in more developed countries, right? It's the transport costs which makes, people move. Is it just discarding an unproductive sector which is becoming worse and worse towards a more productive sector? So it's not just transport costs, it's actually a change of occupation, right? Or a shift in that sense. Is it that actually new kinds of firms are being born and more numbers of firms are being born? So what is driving the cluster effect in India? Or is it that places that used to be clusters are still clusters and now everyone's just using that as some kind of shelling point to move?
First of all, thank you for describing the diversification process so beautifully, Shruti. I think you explained it better than I could have. No, it's a very interesting thing to, see and understand. So a lot of what has happened when I've been traveling on work is you see that there is one firm that sets up their unit and then that creates more jobs. And then the ancillary unit comes up alongside. Pune is a beautiful example of, how your auto-related clusters started coming up. It was a university town to start with, but then that meant that education and higher education institutions started growing there as well. IT also began to layer itself there for similar reasons. It has another twin benefit of being like a sister city to Bombay. So spillover of things which, Bombay would like to have easy access to comes up in Pune. And today it is one of the shared services hub in India. A lot of entities are setting up their shared services practices there. And so these kind of movements, this means that people want to live there. Hill stations around Pune begin to do better, So this is the narrative that I think you beautifully described, that it starts with maybe one or two activities and then there are more. And then people also gravitate towards that. And the neighboring cities and towns like Sangli, like Lavasa is not the best example because for structural reasons it didn't do very well. But ideas like that begin to take shape because of that. Now, what the information seems to tell us is this, that if we look at India's example vis-a-vis other countries, for many countries, what has driven their clustering or has been specialization. They specialize in a couple of sectors, they build their policies around that, they build that competitive advantage, and that seems to be driving how they are growing. If you look at India, and you can look at Lal and Mengiste or other studies before, which kind of guided me to this question, is that diversification seems to be very closely describing or a co-traveler in our growth journey. It is not specialization. It seems to be diversification. So I tried to go deeper into that question, that what is really driving our narrative? Is it true at the regional level that at a country level, our studies may say certain things, but at a regional level, what is driving it? And if you look at some of the tables or the charts that, I've tried to put it through in maps, and so that visually also it comes through that we have at least 2 or 3 more sectors firing in the regions that seem to be doing really very well. That is very telling, because that means that our story is not we specialized in auto and we built that as our competitive advantage, as say Germany may have done. Japan, Germany, some of these countries, their narrative, at least what we know of it, is a few sectors firing narrative.
You've partly answered the question I had when I was reading the book, which is it a story of diversification or is it a story of specialization, right? Because it can be both when it comes to clustering. And what you're talking about it is, in India, very quickly you have clusters that develop into larger clusters, that develop into larger urban areas, which become diversified, right? So a cluster never remains a single firm or a single industry cluster for too long in India. Is that a good way to think about it across different regions, across different states?
I don't know if it is happening very quickly, because some of these have been in the pipeline for some time, and today we are seeing their, them take that shape. But I also think that there are segments where that clustering has not happened in this way, which makes me also question that from a policy point of view, should we be going the SEZ, one district, one product, that kind of a route, or, creating or give primacy to certain products. But the narrative that I'm seeing here, Shruti, is this, that diversification seems to be important for us. And we seem to be doing it well when we do it. That's one. So we should play to our strengths as a country. The second part is this, that it's not an all-out diversification. So there seem to be limits to the benefits of diversification. There is a point beyond which an inverted U kind of story is happening. And so at best, 3 or 4 sectors is what a region should look at. So I do make this premise towards the end of the book, and having looked at a lot of the data, that we are largely, we tend to move towards diversification in places where we are growing well. There are still many places where we are not diversified at all, and that's hurting us when that is happening. But we probably need to look at a model of specialized diversification. And what I mean by that is have the 3 or 4 sectors and specialize in those. Don't spread yourself too thin, but have a wider canvas that you're playing with, so that the regions are able to have things going for them when the chips are down, say, in a couple of sectors. So that's making general intuitive sense also. But it is also playing to our strength that at least 2 or 3 things going together well is something we can manage. And we seem to do that well. And somewhere maybe it's fundamentally ingrained in how our brains work. I have not gone into the causality of why that is so. But I think if it's a strength and if it seems to be working for us, we should look at this principle of specialized diversification. And I would like to think over time how, from a policy perspective, also we could maybe encourage that, incentivize that, and create ways in which, say, a region is not just an IT hub, but we are creating some pathway for it to be a little more than that, which then gives it a broader play.
My sense when I was reading your work on why we don't have these single, highly specialized, industry clusters is basically Indian policy. And this is, since the very beginning, this is since independence, has done 2 things. One, it punishes scale, right? And the second is it punishes scale specifically when we talk about hiring labor. So what we end up getting in India is, even in the clusters, we end up getting lots of small firms, right? And if you're talking about a cluster like auto, which is very capital heavy, then it's an SEZ, something like the Sri Perumbudur corridor in Tamil Nadu, something like that is where you get a cluster because, you introduced 1 or 2 firms, you gave them some privileges in the special economic zone, and then more followed. Often in economics, what we end up seeing is the clustering problem or the lack of specialization or, not enough specialized clusters. But actually the problem might be somewhere quite far removed from it, at least, in the data, which tends to be labor, or which may be, why can't we scale up firms? What are the regulatory or compliance issues which are preventing firms from scaling? Because that's really when you get a highly specialized cluster, right? So that's my sense. So, one way of thinking about it is, you're right, SEZs. But what are SEZs really giving us? They are in part letting us escape the regulatory issue, which is punishing scale everywhere else in India. But within the SEZ, we can sort of create this, we can suspend the crazy regulation that punishes scale, right? That's really what is going on there. We can sort of suspend some of these labor laws. We can suspend some of these land issues. I think your intuition is absolutely right, that that's sort of where we need to go. But I can also think of ways to do it without creating special economic zones. I think the special economic zones will create themselves. If we solve the problem of factor markets in India more broadly and we stop punishing scale, there's no reason Bangladesh has managed to get textile factories going where you have 17,000 workers. And in India, it is difficult to get a lot of factories which have even 1,000 workers or 1,500 workers, right? We don't see too many of them. So I think that might be one explanation of what you see and what you describe towards the end of the book. Do you think my hunch is sort of right, or is this too simple?
I kind of agree, Shruti, that it is a fact that we are punishing scale. And I think the way, what I meant to say with the SEZ approach is, I'm not convinced that is it's still, the way it is structured today, is still a little one size fits all kind of a thing, which is not how we will be able to, create employment or create jobs or build this whole thing about, make every district or every region vibrant. That is not the model which is going to work there. Factor markets, and I think also making it so this question about punishing scale is also related to contract labor very closely, because it helps to keep things informal.
Yeah.
It is, the incentives
Absolutely.
are skewed towards pushing towards greater informality than formalization. And so if we really wanted to, and we don't have ways to capture it except for, say, the economic census or ways like that. But if we actually wanted to capture the productivity of these smaller firms also into our economy, to make financing easier, because there is a whole access to capital issue, which is not happening because creditworthiness for these informal firms becomes harder to establish, and you don't have a track record, so nobody wants to lend to you. So you are then, in that cycle of where the factor payments to capital is higher than the factor payments to other segments. So unlocking some of that, I think, will be on the regulatory front is extremely important. I would like to hope that the kind of energy that we are seeing around Startup India and things like that, we need to show a little more, take a little more risks on the factor markets front and let the market play and settle, so that people and firms are able to get better returns out of what they invest in locally, and not be prescriptive about what the region needs to produce, but to unlock markets, make access better. I think you had also asked this question about, is it transport, is it infrastructure? I do think infrastructure has an important role. In the last 20 years at least, I think we have seen better roads, better connectivity, more airports, greater, corridors which are getting active. I think we need a lot more of that, because if you can't reach somewhere, then nothing is going to, particularly eastern part of the country. I think the eastern and the northeastern part of the country,
especially the hilly eastern part of the country,
hilly regions need far better. Some of that journey, I think, has already started, but I think we need to do a lot more in terms of general access directly through infrastructure. Teledensity and network infrastructure also needs to improve in a number of pockets. I think, the benefits of UPI are to the small businesses. But if we want the benefits of that to reach the last mile, which is the consumer, they need to have better access. So I think everybody has a lot to gain by better digital access. So I'm hoping that some of these are spaces which will see a lot more action in the coming years.
There I completely agree with you. So, all kinds of penetration, whether it's roads and, infrastructure, transport, all of those things. One of the interesting things also I learned from your book is that the very large metropolitan areas actually look quite different from the regular urban centers, which is not that surprising once, you start discussing what's going on. But that even the very large metropolitan areas need to be disaggregated, right? So that was the other big learning I got, because normally we just think of these big metropolitan areas as, oh, this is one really important cluster. But what you actually point out is that these are a collection of clusters, right? It is not a single cluster. So what's happened is something like Delhi or Mumbai, it's clearly has some kind of lighthouse effect, right? It's attracting people to that particular point. But because it's attracting people, industries or sectors that may not have already developed start developing in and around that area. And this is really the story of what is happening in Thane or, what is happening in Dombivli. Mumbai is a great example because now increasingly more and more action is happening in the suburbs, right? So the broader question I have is it necessary that larger cities are necessarily more diverse, like metropolitan areas are more diverse? Or are we just regionally categorizing an area which has highly specialized clusters and we've just put it in one box because geographically it makes sense to put it in one box, right? It has one shared airport, it has one shared railway station. So we've just called this one area, right? So what is the story in those? And I know we have only 4 or 5 of those in India. So, they might be easier to study as specific cases.
My sense of what's happening with the metros, Shruti, is this, that they have grown very, very fast. I mean, in the sense that not fast over time necessarily, but I'm saying in the way in which, development has not been able to keep pace with the influx of people. Let's, put it that way. Or the speed with which commercial or business activity has kind of taken off there. And the good thing, of course, is I think their output per capita or the output of these regions has been really very high. And they have been kind of, if one had to look at growth engines in India today, it would be our metros. At the same time, I think what has also happened is that, like, the way in which urban planning has not kept pace with the way these places have grown. And that also means that Delhi is moving radially, Bombay is growing longitudinally, Thankfully, Bangalore is in a place where, it has grown. It does not have boundaries of different states the way Delhi is, where you have this whole administrative thing of how will you classify it as NCR and, so and so. I see this as also being a transition over time, right? Because say Bombay, it was textile, mills, trading, and then it grew over time and has become the financial capital now. And it has also made its share of, things have not necessarily worked out in Bombay the way they had thought. So, for example, the Central Business District, CBD, which is in Vashi, CBD Belapur, it used to be called in the days when we had just started working, and, Unilever and many others had set up their other offices there in the hope that a lot of work as well as people would move to these suburbs. But what has happened over time is that part has not fired the way it was expected. Bandra Kurla complex, BKC on the other hand, has become the alternate hub to South Bombay.
Absolutely.
So...
Especially because the mill land got so badly tied up, right? So that they couldn't grow there. So now the entire city has shifted north.
Yes.
Or rather the hub has shifted north.
Right. Also, a lot of mill complexes have now got converted into commercial establishments. So your old Lower Parel, Kamla Mills and all of those areas, Peninsula Business Park.
All your hipster cafes.
Yes, all of that is on...
with paper straws.
all of that is on what used to be earlier mill area.
Mill land,
has now become an agglomeration of a different kind. The shopping centers are there. The business second level after South Bombay, next pit stop is Parel, Lower Parel, that part which is the mill area, and the next pit stop after that is Bandra Kurla complex, and then you may go to the others. So another very interesting pattern in Bombay is where a lot of startup ecosystem is in the IIT Bombay area, Powai. So it is a city. If we looked at this particular metro, it has these segments that have grown. It is still part of one narrative. because the reasons why they have set up is because of contiguity, because of proximity to the financial capital. BKC would not have happened if it was not for, the real estate prices being really high in town. I see these as part of the same city because it is movement within that city or choices which are happening because of how one part of the city is operating. And so I don't think it would not be unfair to call it one region. It's still not like a collection of regions, but yes, parts of it like a Kalyan Dombivli, like a Thane, which are then outside of even the municipal jurisdiction, are managed, planned differently. Their incentives are different. And so those segments, we would necessarily need to even treat them as separate million plus cities. So today, even the classification is separate.
And they are actually, you're absolutely right. They're all million plus cities, but they are still thought of as the greater Bombay area, right? There are people who move to Thane but work in Bombay because the housing costs are too high in the region where they work and so on. So how do you see those areas developing? I mean, I know there is a big push that each of them, they already have their own municipal, operations, which are separate. Each one of them is thinking of getting their own individual metro systems and so on, which will link to a broader system, for the entire metropolitan area. But how else do you see that story unfolding, in some sense? Because there is a big difference in the economic development between the suburbs and the Mumbai region, the original Mumbai region. And the second thing that is different is in the suburbs, there is a lot more industrial activity. There's a lot more even farm activity. If you think about dairy, right? There's dairy farming is a serious thing in some of these suburbs like Kalyan. Whereas in the Mumbai region, I mean, you don't have, heavy industry, certainly not. You have light industry, you have like much more informal establishments. So that is one important distinction that I see. But how else do you see this sort of, regional diversity within the metropolitan area unfolding?
So interestingly, I'd done, as we are speaking, I'm just pulling out this segment in, chapter 5, where we talk about economic diversity at the regional level. I'd actually tried to look at these million plus cities and look at how does the diversity index work for these. So we had constructed a diversity index for each of the regions, which was basically what is the concentration of economic activity that people are employed in, which are the sectors that people are employed in. And if one is capturing it by a measure, which is the diversity index, then, and that goes on a scale of 0 to 1. So if it is closer to 1, it means that it is a highly diverse region in terms of economic activity. Closer to 0 is lesser on that axis. This was done for all the regions that, one captured in the book. But I also did that particularly for the million plus cities, just to see that, what is happening at the million plus city level. Kalyan Dombivli is ranked highest on its diversity index. It has a 0.89.
Yeah, because it still has dairy farms also, and it still has startups, yes. Right? It's one of those places.
Correct. And do you want to take a guess of which one is number 2?
Thane? Ghaziabad, one of those? Yeah, exactly, right?
Thane, very good, 10 marks. 0.88, Thane is at 0.88.
Thank you, Professor Dore.
Yes, and the next one after that is Hyderabad, also a 0.88, and then we have Pune, Pimpri Chinchwad, which is 0.87. Bombay is actually fairly down there. Greater municipal area of Bombay is fairly down there because it is largely financial services, trade, real estate. But the real diversification is, in the Nagpur is higher than Bombay.
Yeah. No, this, now after reading things at the regional level, this is now no longer surprising me because I've read your book, right? Unlike the listeners who are getting this for the first time, which is the story in India seems to be first there is some kind of cluster, right? People move to that cluster, then that area diversifies a little bit. And after it diversifies, then again there is gains from specialization. So it again starts specializing because, the mill land is now no longer productive use of that land, right? Or dairy farms. Very soon as Kalyan develops further, it is not going to have too many dairy farms because that is not going to be the best use of that space. So I think all these areas, the time when you've captured them, that they are more diverse. My sense is when you run this study, maybe another 10 or 15 years from today, they will come back to look more like Bombay. And then their satellite areas will start looking like what Kalyan, Dombivli look like today, right? Is that a good way to think about how this is happening?
Yeah, I think so too. Because they will specialize a little more and they will still probably be in the 75 to 80 range of diversification, but maybe not so close to point 0.9.
One important question I had before I let you go, you start the book with, India's sort of plan goals historically, right? That India needs to grow, it needs to grow faster, poorer regions need to catch up, and there needs to be balance in regional development. Like this has been 5-year plan goal since the very beginning, right? Now, by the end of the book, when I finish reading and how India is transforming structurally, the first question I had was, does this goal make any sense, or is it totally stupid to hold on to this goal? Like, what does balanced regional development even mean, and why should we strive for it, right? Shouldn't the thing we strive for as a country be that, people are able to go wherever they wish to go? They're able to access whatever market they wish to, access, or whatever, whether it's an education market, labor market, whether, it's employment, urban areas. Isn't that the important goal, that we make it sort of frictionless for them to transition? And balanced regional development as a policy goal almost seems like they're going to do something stupid to get in the way of that. So that's how I was thinking about it. But how do you feel about this? Because that's sort of where you begin the book. That's your motivation. But you end at quite a different point from where you start.
That's a great question, Shruti. My reading of this would be that it's a fact that this balance is hard. It's like one of those targets you set yourself up for, which is really utopian almost. I would still like to believe that making it frictionless is definitely something which has to happen, which needs to happen. Simply because the size of the population, the number of people who are going to get impacted by this is so huge. It is the fastest growing country in the world. And if this is the population that we're talking about, then there have to be ways to make, access to this populace happen. So that is one. Definitely making business frictionless, making money transfer frictionless, making the ease of doing business and ease of living as a whole is essential. At the same time, I would not want to let go of that, broader principle or dream of, balanced regional development, for the simple reason that I do believe there is still going to be a significant set of people that are not going to be able to move in the near future. They are going to be where they are. And there is going to need to be some amount of in situ development to reach there. If we are looking at the most marginalized communities or tribal populations, there are people who have chosen to be there and who are maybe not wanting to, move. And a similar story is also that there is only so much capacity that some regions are going to have to be able to absorb the flows of people. And what we are going to see is undue pressure on infrastructure or policy if it's going to be completely driven by let people move wherever they want to, but we will not focus at all on in situ redevelopment. So I would like to ideally see a case where we are doing both. We are making it frictionless. We are saying that the fundamental right where you can work from anywhere is something that the Constitution is meant to guarantee, and we put in things that allow for that, whether it is the ability to access a ration card wherever you are in this country, the ability to put your vote. You had asked an earlier question, why are people so tied to the land? It's because their vote bank is there. So
absolutely,
if they do not have voting rights in certain parts of the country, there is going to be no way for them to exercise their agency. So they will want to have some foothold in some place where people can exercise agency. So these are things we have to think about. There are no, of course, clear and ready answers. But making movement frictionless, using our digital narrative where we are doing quite well today to really, build on that. But not all the answers are going to be digital. We have to take care of our basic physical infra issues, which is healthcare. education and at the rural points, because children are going to get who are growing up in the village, they're going to be able to come to a city or something only much later in their lives. And if we miss out,
and they have to be educated and skilled for
exactly,
it.
and if we miss out on the first 10-15 years of what their personalities can become, I see my own daughter. I know we have a limited time span where we're going to be able to influence how she thinks and what she's going to be able to do. And that's a much larger narrative if we look at a population like ours as a country. So my vote would be for significant amount of energy to go to make regions vibrant, because then that means that, and vibrance is about making healthcare, of a certain standard, making education available, making the workforce capable to be able to move anywhere and deliver anywhere. And I would say a lot of Indians are going to go abroad as well, right? You write a lot about how the Indian workforce is going to be something that caters to a global market or a global audience. So we have to have our people ready for that, not only for the benefit of this country, but globally. We have to have a workforce that is fit, which is able, to, deliver. And to have this place as a market for those goods and services that are going to come from other places. So I think it is in the greater enlightened self-interest for both to happen, for it to be frictionless, but also for regional economies themselves to be vibrant enough to be both great producers and consumers.
I completely agree with that part. It's just the reason I thought this is a crazy goal is that usually the way it has translated into policy action is not how you are describing it. See, you're describing the government needs to provide basic public goods and services and then quasi-public goods, right? It needs to get into healthcare and things like that. Whereas normally the government's idea of balanced regional development is we put one iron ore in that place. So now we got to put an iron ore in this state, in this area, right? We put a textile clustering there. So it's also, these 100 smart cities, they can't all be clustered around the greater Mumbai metropolitan area where there's actually a demand for smart cities. They need to be, 4 in each state or something like, we're going to divvy it up. That's what I mean by, is it a sensible policy goal? Because you're absolutely right. We do need every region to have the opportunity to become productive. Right? Whereas the way this is normally translated is they put an industry or a sector in a place where it just makes no sense. Firms don't wish to go there and the labor doesn't wish to go there. So, it's like this planned economic development, planned balanced regional development. That's the part which kind of makes me wonder if that makes sense anymore. But you've clearly moved far away from that. You are now thinking very much about the government just providing public goods, public services so that the market-based structural transformation can center around itself. And the people who don't wish to move, of course, they don't have to move.
Absolutely. No, you're right in that the tendency of things to become prescriptive is what we need to guard against. So I'm teaching social finance this semester. One of the students actually asked me a very good question on the side that, how do we solve for some of these things where this, prescriptive format of decision making, why don't we let people decide? Can we unlock things? And which is, I think, along the lines of what you were also saying, can we think of policy which helps things be a little more frictionless, which lets people invest in the industry that is locally going to work, because people know the intuitive local business sense has to be allowed to play out. So I would definitely like to see a space where we allow, say, social finance to play a more important role, microfinance to trigger what kind of local businesses will grow better. Let the MSMEs, choose what areas they're going to find a market in and specialize, and that will then help people to be competitive. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in a situation where you say these 3 sectors we have to build, and so we'll give you these tax incentives, and then there's another layer of subsidies around that, and then there's more taxpayer income which is stuck there, which need not necessarily be making the market. So yeah, I think I'm somewhere in that mix of some things we need to behave like a welfare state, but for the others, we really need to let the market play out and, strengthen its ability to be accountable. So I would see a better role for the judiciary for things like that, where you enforce law enforcement, make some of these strong so that it is not in people's, we are not incentivizing people to cheat. We're not incentivizing people to, game the system, but we are letting the market function really well. I would love to see that. But it takes a lot of, I think planning as a function needs to think in a more out of the box and less prescriptive kind of a format.
Before I let you go, I want to also get into a little bit about your background. And this might be helpful to our listeners, who have an academic and sort of rigorous training, but wish to work in policy, which is exactly how your career has, panned out. And you, of course, you work as the Director of Analytics, Insights and Impact at Tata Trust, right? So you yourself not only do research and you look at how you wish to see India from a policy perspective, but you're also funding people through the Tata Trust, people who are working on this kind of research. And you're also looking at policy and evaluating the impact of, specific policy programs or specific philanthropic programs that the Tata Trust funds. How do you see this transition from sort of, standard PhD in economics kind of academic training into what you see at the policy level? What are academics missing? What are the sorts of things that academics, especially economists in India, should be working on that they don't work on because you have this very unique lens and you're able to see what's happening on the ground?
I actually became a researcher by accident. I think I was doing work on the ground and, visiting the markets as part of what I was doing at Tata Capital, advising CEOs, CFOs, or planning financial structures, and then later development programs. And in that process, I felt that I would like to, revisit what have the greats said and done on these issues of access and, how do you make capital more thoughtful? How do you, solve for some of the deeper questions? And so I came to the PhD later in life, and it was more of a felt need. I did not know how it would translate into work or opportunities or even career. But I think I wanted to visit what the greats have said. And I also wanted to unpack these questions for myself with some amount of, in Hindi we call it therav, which you don't get when you are on your day job and on the accelerator. So I was not able to do it with too much therav because I did it side by side with my work. And I don't know if I would necessarily recommend that route to anybody because it's very killing. But I think I've been richer.
No, I remember when I saw you towards the end, I think you were defending your dissertation. You were still working full time. And I think you were in your third trimester when you had to defend something like that. And I remember meeting you and I was like, oh, good God, how are you doing all of this and still managing to get this done? So,
You're right.
Yeah. I mean, Terra or not, you certainly checked off the Superwoman box that day when I saw you. This is, of course, many years ago.
Thank you. That is music to my ears. So yes, my daughter Devika was, she participated in my PhD defense from the inside. I've been richer for the process of having, gone through this rigor, because I think the way I look at some of these questions and the way I'm able to unpack some of this, I feel that I have a body of work that I have read or that I have, familiarized myself with, that I can lean back on and draw from when, I'm trying to build or think or plan. And I found it extremely, extremely, very useful. It's of course great to be able to put it in the form of a book, which, I'm able to share with a larger audience. And that process also, Shruti, for me has been a way of pushing the narrative forward or bringing more people into the conversation. And I realized that there are more people like me who are thinking about these questions, when they travel, when they see the world, whether they are on the business side or working in policy or on development. These seem to be, I met a lot more people as part of my work and PhD journey who have similar questions. And so one of the things which I found to, address what you were asking is that I think what the world of practice needs and what often PhD students work on, there is sometimes a gap, because, it could be you're researching a question because your guide had 3 students before that, and this is the 4th question in that. And so, you do not know which question to pick. So you think that's an interesting area to work on, which is fine. It depends on your life stage and how you, get into your PhD journey. But I also think there are a lot of very important questions for the world of practice that, need deep work. And a PhD or a research process is a great way to do that homework, which can be of great use to the community of practice as well. And so, questions around, so the regional question was something that I had the opportunity to engage with. But I do see a lot of PhD students, say in the sciences, working a lot on, say, cancer care or medical treatment or things like that, which their labs are clearly focused upon to, contribute back to the world of practice. I would like to see a lot more of that in the humanities and social sciences and economics kind of spaces too. I do see many young people doing that as well. And my suggestion there would be, or my hope there would be, a lot more conversations between academia and practice and government, because a lot of these institutions talk different languages but are working towards similar goals. And from my seat, where I have the opportunity to engage with business and government, and I think I'm very fortunate. And I've also, I think, chosen these spaces where I get to meet, and it's something that I look for, and I make sure that I'm in the room where those conversations are happening, because I see a lot of cross-pollination possible. And I do not believe it is possible for any one agency to crack it completely. So, for example, something like you're doing at Mercatus, where you are seeding entrepreneurs or ideas in places like these, I think universities have great opportunity to, push the boundary of thought, to test and pilot things which the commercial sector may not be able to do immediately. And so partnerships of that form can be extremely potent. And I think students should also go and spend a lot of time on the field. Field work should not be something that you're like, oh my God, now the guide is insisting and so I need to do. But I think look at it as an experience, as one of the best experiences of engaging with the world outside. I think I have learned the most when I am out there meeting people, talking to them and understanding real world problems. That helps you define your problem statement much better and create something that will be valuable, not just for an A-star publication, but for the world to use, in the times to come.
Yeah, and what I really liked about the book, which is of course the outcome of, all the work that you've done over 1 decade, maybe even longer, is you've taken a subject which is classically a development economics, development policy kind of question, and you've merged it with ideas that we typically only study in urban economics, right? Or we only study in industrial organization, right? When we're talking about clustering, when we're talking about agglomeration. So this is the thing that I actually find missing in most academic work when it's talking about India. It's like very narrow. Nowadays in development economics, the thing that is in vogue is randomized control trials, right? Looking at the narrowest of narrow slivers and not making these broader connections that, people don't kind of live their life. They walk into a healthcare center, they say, oh, now this is the health economics part of my life. And then they exit that and then they enter their office and then they're like, oh, this is the clustering part of my life. Like that is just not how we function as human beings, right? We make certain decisions, and our economic, social, personal, household decisions, education decisions, everything is sort of deeply entangled. And so what I really like about the book is, other than shining the light on just how vast India is and that we need to get more granular and what that granular snapshot looks like, the lovely thing you've done when you show the difference between 2004-5 and 11-12, that period, you're actually showing us that structural transformation that is taking place, which is development. That is, there is a labor part to it. There is an urban part to it. There is an industrial clustering part to it. There is diversification and there is economic development and infrastructure building. So all of those things are going on simultaneously, which is quite lovely to see in any kind of academic work which is trying to influence development policy. So this was such a pleasure, both to read and to chat with you. We never catch up like this. So this is truly a delight. Thank you so much for coming, Poornima. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much, Shruti, and thank you for seeing the book through this lens, which I think gives it so much color. Thank you.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.